With a shake in her head to clear the thoughts, she stepped down from the entrance of Stalingrad Library and looked at this direction where the note had been pointing. It didn't take her long for her eye to spot a similar piece of paper on the wall of one of the buildings near the library, almost hidden by the fog, but just visible enough for her to see it. It was pointing straight ahead, most likely to another note hidden within the town. Twilight brought herself to quickly trot once more, heading down the ashen streets of Ponyville. Her eyes wandered for any lumbering soldiers that might attempt to attack her, while also keeping a lookout for new notes. One by one, they appeared to be on the sides of the buildings, pointing further and further towards the outskirts of town. They traveled such a long distance, she thought to herself, realizing how actually this was from the library. That's a long time for Spike to be in danger. What was he thinking? Where were they headed? She didn't like the idea of the baby dragon had been exposed to any more of this town than it was necessary. It was already taking a heavy toll on her mind. As it was, she couldn't even imagine Spike having to go through some of the things that she had seen already. She didn't want him to have seen the things that she'd seen. She wanted Spike to be safe. She wanted nothing more than to lift this fog and return to Ponyville, having a thriving small town that it once was. Back to a home she could be proud of. Not the blood-coated streets now she walked. Her trotting slower to a walk, but before coming almost a slow crawl, stopping entirely. She blinked to her realization of where the notes had led her, completely unobstructed by locked doors and any sign of monsters. She found herself standing before the entrance of the familiar grove of trees. She was right in the front of Sweet Apple Acres. Did they really escape to Sweet Apple Acres? Her mind asked, looking at the various street trees that she could see. All of them had shriveled up and died, yet they were somehow miraculously attached to limbs of them. She couldn't spot any apples, although, as to be expected, having the harvesting season as well ended before the start of winter. Twilight had certain that the apple family had removed all the dead leaves from the trees yet before the winter hit. Yet there were still blackened, shriveled up leaves at the top of each of them. I suppose it would make sense if Spike was with Margus. He was probably the one who had the idea of going there. And if Applejack was anywhere, she'd be there trying to protect her family first. She wouldn't have just abandoned them if she knew that they were in danger. The thought gave Twilight some comfort and a bit of hope. The idea that maybe Spike and Magus had met up with Applejack and her family, and that he used his magic to keep them safe, and they would be wanting her to be safe and sound within the familiar red barn. She wanted to grasp onto that hope, that Lance's words had came to her mind once more. As long as she believed that the town was winning, it was going to win. Her mind was flattering, and she was aware of it. It was straining from her how illogical, cruel, and vile the town had become. She had needed something to grasp onto now. Something had to give her the strength to move forward, so she clung onto the hope she'd see them again. She stepped into the forest. A shadow flashed out of the corner of her eye, and she immediately swiveled on her head in the direction. She stared into the foggy dens of the trees, scanning slowly for her eyes, trying to spot the movement that had been. For a moment she thought that her mind was playing tricks on her, but she knew that she couldn't let herself fall into that false sense of security. Not now. She lifted her front legs slowly to continue to walk deeper into the forest of Sweet Apple Acres. As she slowly removed the sledgehammer from her magic, she hoovered it slowly by her side and strained her ears carefully. That rune that hung from her neck was imitating a strange static it normally did when a creature was close. So that was a sign that told her that she was safe, but it didn't mean she'd stay that way. She heard the sound of leaves crunching under her hooves and snapped her head in that direction. Ready for that sound this time, her eyes stared intently into the fog. There was nothing in there in that tree, staring back at her almost tauntingly. Was something, though, following her through the woods? She wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. It was exactly as the kind of thing she would expect this town to do right now. She gently swung the sledgehammer into the air and immediately felt the difference in the weight distribution from the woods that she experienced in the welding. There was no way she would be able to actively fight with such a strange bulky weapon on her. It would do anything than attack her good conclusion if she could get a clear shot, but it lacked any fitness with the weapon it should. However, she was not going to give in whatever was following her the idea that she was unable to defend herself. And at that moment she could continue slowly through the dead trees. If she remembered correctly, she was certain that she did. It wouldn't take her long to reach the barn from its ends of the woods. Positioning the trees that looked familiar, she had seen through them several times, with Applejack starting to call them a second home from Ponyville. If she followed the trees, she was straight, and if she'd be able to make it to the barn before the buzz of the rune began to buzz, letting out the familiar warning she dreaded. Her head frantically snapped back and forth, trying to find the location of the source, before swiveling on in time to see a large object coming from behind her. The object struck her body hard, air escaping her lungs as she was hurled into the air. Her back hit the ground first, and the shock forcing her to roll into the thick ash before sliding to a stop. A pained groan escaped Twilight's lips as she managed to stand up, grateful that she had been avoided being hurled into any of the trees. She spotted a sledgehammer having been landed next to her quickly, wrapped in her magic around it, raising it to face whatever creature it had haunched in its back. Her heart sank as she saw, just a few yards away from her, the pulsing black orb that had been to blend reality around herself. From its center, its black-skinned pony had begun to pull free from its twisting mess of shadows that had surrounded it. It let out the horrific low-pitched howl from its swooned mouth. The pale, pupilless eyes popped open, and two hooves extended and slammed onto the ground, held by the shackles and chains that stretched onto the darkness. It was the same creature that had separated her from Lance back in the hotel, but Lance was nowhere in sight right now, its pure-eyed wise eyes seeming to be pierced right straight through her. Terror shot her through her spine, her body instinctively backing away slowly as her pendant roared its calliope static. It growled its low-pitched howl as if pulling itself out of the murky, shadowy orb. It was painful. The shackles rattled and cracked its head, looking at her, as if from the sides of black ribbons began to ooze out once more. Twilight glanced at the sledgehammer she had been floating in front of her, and then back at the creature, watching as the ribbons grew longer. In the realization of what she was faced with, now she was fighting with her, hit her like a sack of bricks. I can't fight this thing with the sledgehammer. The orbed creature let out a loud piercing roar through its shrown mouth, and the ribbons were not shot forward. Reality was snapping back to her. Twilight jumped. The ribbons swerved, trying to reach the escaping unicorn, crash into the various dead trees surrounding her in the process. She found herself tumbling through the ashes once more. The broken twigs and splintered wood flying over her head. The ribbons began to retract as Twilight stood up the shackled legs and the warp fuddling loudly against the ground as it began to turn its body to face her. She didn't even have the time to need it to refocus its efforts on her, turning and pushing against the ground and to escape. She broke out into a frantic run, racing through the dead woods that made up the apple orchard. Her mind was screaming at her to get to the barn. The sound of snapping wood and collapsing trees echoed right behind her as those large blackened ribbons flew for a few inches away from her head. A mass of skin-like cloth struck a pair of particularly large trees in front of her, causing the trees in front of her to crack loudly as they began their downwards crashing arc. Twilight's eyes widened as she saw the large trees begin to crash down in front of her, directly in her path. She gritted her teeth and concentrated her magic, shooting it forward as the trees came coming down. They immediately froze in place, suspended by the purple magic as Twilight escaped underneath them. Once past them, her magic broke free and they crashed loudly into the forest floor. A loud roar of the black-orbed monstrosity echoed throughout the trees as Twilight's panting grew louder. The buzzing of her medallion gradually slowed into a dulled hum before becoming silent itself. Twilight peeked over her shoulder as she continued to run, not seeing the ribbons or the creature itself chasing after her. She didn't even dare breathe a sigh of relief, though, Not until she was sure she was in the clear. She was close to reaching the barn of how, though, she had to clear the orchard. The familiar red barn slowly came into view, looking worse and wear as much as the same as everything else did. But Twilight was elated to some of the nevertheless. The forest line cleared around her, and she finally in her familiar opening to her friend's home. She wasted no time bolting straight for the door, only slowing down to walk once she was straight at the front steps. She slipped her the sledgehammer she had always been carrying the whole time back into her inventory and stared at the door plastered in front of what it was the blue runic symbol that Magus had just told her about. The one that drove the monsters away. Her heart rose in her throat in hope, praying that whatever was behind that door was exactly what she wanted, that reason that she had come for. Her hoof twitched hesitantly as she reached for the door. She was nervous now, thinking that she had come to this far gone enough as much, and that right behind the door was exactly what she'd been searching for. Though throughout the horrible things, it could be behind the door as well. Some new monstrosity she'd never seen before could have managed to break through the symbol, or possibly it was Lance said it was a fake versions of people she cared about. Her hoof pressed on against the door as she tried to swallow the lump in her throat. It was making it hard for her to breathe. She turned the knob, finding it was indeed unlocked, and gently swung the door open, taking a step inside to see what was waiting. The first thing she spotted was a lit fireplace in the living room. In front, where the flickering flames, were two figures. One scruffy-looking unicorn stallion, turned over, and the other, Twilight! A small purple blur got up to where it had been sitting, rushed over to her, wrapping his arms around, and she scooted over the unicorn that had walked into the door. Twilight stared down in shock at the baby dragon that was hugging her, nesting in affection. "I'm so glad you're okay. I was worried." His body shook as he hugged her. The lump in Twilight's throat didn't fade, but instead it seemed to grow bigger. She began to tremble as she felt her body collapsed into a sitting position. Her hooves snapped up and wrapped around the baby dragon tightly, squeezing him near to her chest as tears began to streak down her face. "Spike, it's really you? Oh, thanks, Celestia, it's you," she said shakily, a bright smile forming on her face as she presented her face to his head. The two of them seemed to stood there in embrace at the doorway, not caring for a moment what the outside world held the distant abominations and horrors. That she had seen things she just wished she never had to relieve. But it all mattered that she was holding Spike again, closely holding to someone who she loved him so dearly. "I told you I'd take care of him, Miss Sparkle," Magus said, looking at the scene with affection and a chuckle. "I am a stallion of my word." "Thank you, Magus." It was all Twilight could manage to get out between the tears streaking down her dirty face. She was just happier than she ever could believe, happier than she thought she'd be able just to hold Spike again. "Twilight, you're covered in ash," Spike said, lifting his arm to see that it was now covered simply from hugging the unicorn. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up. We found some clean water we can use." He broke the hug first to lead Twilight to where she could get cleaned up. Twilight couldn't help but watch in awe as a little dragon who still cared more about her well-being than the horrors that seemed to be surrounding them. It was almost surreal, escaping the white world of death and coming into one that it was in a loving embrace to it. Her smile returned to her face as she turned, stepped and closed the door behind her, just letting the moment soak in. "Yeah, let's get me cleaned up."